Good morning, and thank you for joining this next discussion on the geopolitical and multilateral dimensions of fragmentation. For this discussion, we have two really outstanding experts, one who is a scholar and a thought leader and a foreign policy thinker of the first rank. The other is a diplomat deeply steeped in these issues. Professor Joe Nye is a University Distinguished Service Professor at Harvard and the former Dean of the Kennedy School of Government. And in the 1990s, he was the chairman of the National Economic Council. What's exciting for the purposes of this discussion, I think, is that I can think of no other scholar who has bridged the gap between understanding with great depth the nuclear revolution and the information revolution and the cyber realm, which we'll be talking about today, and which Professor Nye, no doubt, will be opining on. And our second expert, of course, is Ambassador Lana Nusseibeh. She is the permanent representative of the United Arab Emirates to the United Nations. Most significantly, for the purposes of this discussion, she was the co-facilitator of the recent World Summit on the Information Society at the UN, a major global gathering that celebrated a 10th anniversary from the first World Summit, and that was a extremely high-level effort to define what the consensus was on these issues about global internet governance. And I should note that the UAE has played a very significant role in these issues, hosting the World Conference on International Telecommunications in Dubai in 2012, and they will play a similar role at the ITU Plenipotentiary in 2018. So let's jump right in and first try to assess just where we are with respect to this process of fragmentation. Professor Nye, you have written on this subject in some depth, and you have acknowledged that fragmentation is in fact a reality. Sketch for us, if you will, in an empirical sense, where are we with the fragmentation of the global internet, and how advanced is the process?
Well, I would, first of all, it's nice to be with you all, and here at Columbia, where Merritt Jano has done a wonderful job of going from 0 to 100 in a very short amount of time, so it's a pleasure to be here. But on the fragmentation question, I think there was once a rather utopian view of the internet. You know, it was this ethereal thing and was from end to end, anywhere in the world, and so forth. And then as people began to realize that though the internet had its head in the clouds at one layer, under each cloud was a server or set of servers which was within a sovereign jurisdiction, and governments had the capacity to do something about that. And so the thinking about this has gone from the sort of the utopian view that I guess Bill Drake put it very nicely in his paper, that the idea that any endpoint in the world can connect with any other endpoint in the world seamlessly, that's just not the world we live in. And it's particularly not the world you live in when the largest internet country, which is China, has a great firewall, among other things. So the argument that we talk as though the internet is not fragmented is that left over from our heads in the cloud. But I think what's intriguing to me is that sometimes we take it to the point of saying, well, it's all downhill, it's going to splinter. I think you quote an article I wrote about the splinter net and so forth. But I think, in fact, there's a great danger with that. I see the governance structures for internet and cyber as what I call a regime complex. And if you think of of a spectrum, at one end of the spectrum of governance is a neat hierarchical regime, a set of rules, norms, and institutions that structure things consistently. And at the other end is complete fragmentation, sort of a total Wild West. A regime complex is a set of partial regimes and institutions intermediary between those two endpoints. And it is important to think about that because it gets you away from the kind of thinking that we had at the end of Wicked in 2012. There were some people like Milton Muller, I think, and Alex Klimberg, who wrote about a new Cold War. You know, that there was now two views of the world.
Can you just, for the audience, explain what happened at the Wicked in 2012?
Well, the vote was, I think, 89. You were there. It was 89 to about 45.
89 to 55.
To 55. And it was seen by many observers as the UN was going to try, with the support of the authoritarian states and the Group of 77, was going to try to take over the governance of the internet. The ITU would be the central focal point. And that vote was seen as I think Klimberg and Muller both used the term, a new Cold War. I think that there's a big mistake in that because when you look carefully among the group that voted against, there were some who had similar values, and there wasn't just one issue. There were a lot of issues that were going on. And if you think of a regime complex in which there are a lot of sub-issues and a lot of norms, then you get away from this either or. You know, it's either the UN or not, or it's one group, the G77 plus the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, trying to run the internet and not. I drew out a quote from Laura Denardis, who is always smart on everything, but on this one in particular, she says that trying to talk about whether the UN should run the internet is a meaningless question. There's so many different issues and so many different aspects that just to see one hierarchical structure doesn't make any sense, not to mention the fact that the ITU doesn't have the capacity to do it. But if you think of a whole series of different issues, crime, sabotage, war, espionage, privacy, content control, human rights, trade, there are different alignments on each of these issues and different distributions of power, different sets of norms that are borrowed from outside the cyber area, from the trade regime or from the intellectual property regime or from the law of armed conflict and so forth. And if you think of that as a regime complex, which affects different issues in different ways, it may be better to have some degree of fragmentation than not. The argument essentially is that a regime complex is loosely coupled. And when there's loose coupling, there's more resilience in the face of not just political differences, but technological change, which is very volatile. And that means that, for example, the US and China can have quite different positions on freedom of speech or on content control or on human rights on the internet, and still have common interests in trade. And we're even able to set up some common interests on espionage in the Obama-Xi agreement in September of 2015. So rather than seeing it as either or, you know, that the Wicked vote was the new Cold War, we see it as a regime complex. You are able to see a number of normative structures which sometimes reinforce, sometimes conflict with each other, but which leave a fair amount of flexibility, issue by issue, for governments to work together. And that gives you a little different picture than the argument that it's one linear slope from the old utopian internet down to total fragmentation. In fact, I think we're going to be in this type of regime complex structure for decades or more. I don't see a UN treaty, or I think the aspiration for a UN treaty, as Laura says, is just the wrong goal. So I would say that we need to adjust our thinking when we talk about fragmentation and governance or normative structures to a more complex reality. Bill's paper, which he did with Cerf and Kleinwachler, is, I think, one of the best papers I've seen describing the different aspects of fragmentation. What I'm trying to do is just put this in the broader context of governance.
Ambassador, Professor Nye was referencing the Dubai conference in 2012, and for those in the audience not familiar with what happened, that conference was convened to negotiate the global rules of international telecommunications that had not been updated since 1989, the pre-internet era. The conference collapsed on the penultimate night before it was supposed to complete with a signed treaty because a resolution was introduced that elevated the role of a UN body called the International Telecommunication Union, the ITU, to have a central role in the evolution of the internet. Now, Ambassador, you've been tracking these issues for a number of years, and you recently presided over a successful WSIS. Tell us, from your perspective, what are the major the spectrum of views from major member states in the UN on how the different vision of the role of the UN for the governance of the network?
Thank you very much, and I'd like to echo Professor Nye. It's a pleasure to be here and get out of our Turtle Bay bubble at the UN, where we think everyone's listening to every statement and resolution that we negotiate, when in fact, I think the academics and the professors are light years ahead in terms of describing the current state of governance around the internet, actually, than governments are. And I think that goes to a fundamental problem in the system. The fundamental problem that I see in the system is that governments are very much on a learning curve with this subject. And I think that was demonstrated in 2012 in how the future, if you like, of internet governance, and that's a very loaded phrase, I'm aware of that, is managed. And it's very much reflected today as we move through the various UN processes that try to put some kind of normative or regulatory framework around some very, very fast technological developments that we are not keeping pace with. I think at the outset it's important to state that during the process that I co-facilitated, the WSIS, which built on a number of processes already in play from 2003 in Tunis and 2005 in Geneva, leading to the review that happened in New York and that will be built upon in the future. Very few governments, if any, in the world do not recognize the enormous potential and the positive benefits of the coming technological revolution that hasn't happened in some countries and has happened in others. So I think very few countries are not trying in some way or another or not poised to try and harness that for the development of their societies, for the development of their economies, for the additional trillions that will add to those economies, for the bridging of divides that we can see technology brings, whether it's the gender divide, and today I believe that only 49% of women are connected to the internet in one way or another, so the gender divide is still a very critical issue, and that was addressed during the WSIS process. The development versus developed divide, with remaining 3 billion to still be connected and harness the positive developments of technology for their economies and for their livelihoods. So I think very few governments do not see the importance of not being left behind. And I think that very much is reflected in the debates that come out during intergovernmental processes. I think where governments are potentially behind, and I think this has been described in the first panel and will be discussed during the rest of this symposium, where governments are potentially behind to varying degrees is the multi-stakeholder model in all its benefits and with all its challenges. How to create various platforms or bubbles for addressing problems that have arisen with this development. And I think it's naive to say there haven't been problems. I think it's naive to say that along with technology there haven't been problems, whether in the area of security that was outlined earlier, whether in the area of cybercrime, child pornography, terrorism. And these are very real issues and very fundamental issues that governments have to address on a daily basis. So how to couple that with the power centers that have evolved within companies, within technology companies. Today, Facebook at almost 2 billion users, even if it's an outdated means of communication to teenage children, but still at less than 2 billion users, is fundamentally more powerful in power terms than many countries. Its population, if you look at it in population terms, is far larger. Similarly, other countries, whether it's other companies, whether it's Apple, whether it's Google, represent bigger weights potentially in a UN process than countries. So Apple would be sort of the 45th largest economy if you look at it in GDP terms, bigger than Belgium, Sweden, and other countries sitting around a table today, supposedly negotiating norms. So I think the power dynamics, the way power has shifted, is important to understand, and it's important for governments to understand them. And I think it's important for governments to be able to sit as equal partners with these companies, with these new power centers, and discuss solutions. And I do subscribe to the view that these development companies that have developed these technologies are very much part of the solution. I think the old model, where development for the sake of development of new technology and new ideas is simply left unparalleled, isn't working for a number of citizens around the world. It isn't working because it threatens fundamental norms of what governments can provide to their citizens, whether it's security, whether it's access, whether it's competition in these fields. So I think, move that to the question that you raised, 2012 to 2017, we've seen a huge evolution in the way governments are trying to grapple with and understand this process. We've seen a huge evolution in how governments are trying to interact with the other power centers who are very much partners in this. And I think that if you look at the UN, you do see an institution that, for all its flaws, remains quite a trusted institution in terms of its universality. And that's an important legitimacy that can't be replicated in very many places around the world. So for smaller countries that don't have a Silicon Valley, it is an important space to say that I want access to this technology too. I want equal access. I want to bridge my gender divide in digital technology. I want to make sure that my companies are competitive in this space. And I also want norms and regulatory environments that protect my children from cyber criminals. So I think that the space is important with all of its flaws. And I think today, if we look at sort of 3 or 4 major trends that can be described as shaping the future of the world order as we all see it, as people like Dr. Kissinger describe it, as people like Professor Nye describe it, you are seeing the erosion of public trust in governments. You are seeing an increase in trust in some multilateral institutions. There was a recent McKinsey study at the World Economic Forum that actually showed that in a number of countries, a huge amount of countries, I believe including the US, there was a high level of trust in the UN versus the level of trust in government. And I think that that is reflective of the fact that people are looking to the multilateral order, they're looking to the post-45 order and asking, how will it evolve in order to protect fundamental basic, first of all, rights, and the human rights discussion that happens at the UN I think is a very important one. But 2, how will it allow for development of the developing world to catch up with the developed without impositions on that development. So I think that's one mega trend, if you like, that is shaping public and government discourse on this. Transnationalism, the transnational nature of threats. I think that, again, if you look at many of the threats that governments are facing today, whether it's in the field of cyber or it's in the field of trafficking, terrorism, and other threats, there is no other way of tackling those problems except in an institution like the UN, because you can't simply tackle them within the borders of the traditional sovereign state anymore, because you can't control anymore what happens in the sort of linear lines of your country. And I think Anne-Marie Slaughter's recent book on this is a very interesting one that describes the sort of broad network of the way that we should be looking at the geography of the world today, the interconnectedness of people across country lines, across border lines. And I think it's for governments to start adapting and also learning to look at the world in that way, the web of connections, in addition to, of course, and nothing really, I don't think, in the foreseeable future will replace the traditional sovereign state structure, but how to work with these 2 parallel or 3 parallel interconnected worlds is going to be very much a fundamental problem for governments to address. And I think that governments have a lot of catch-up to do in that way of thinking about the world, and I think that they have to do it in partnership with all the various stakeholders. So the multi-stakeholder model is fundamentally an important one, a correct one for addressing and grappling with the challenges posed. Having said that, the multilateral model over policies within individual countries, I think, is also a very important principle that a number of countries feel beholden to in terms of trying to provide key services, key security for their citizens. So I think that dynamic, that tension, if you like, between the two models continues to exist today. It was very apparent at the Wicket in Dubai, of course, but I think it has evolved, and I agree with Professor Nye that it's not a polarized world anymore, but with one set of countries in one category and another set of countries in another. I think that the lines are much, much more fluid. If you look at the roles, for example, that Brazil and India have played in trying to merge the two models, multi-stakeholder and multilateral, which was very evident in the WISES process, saying that, of course, on the technical issues, the multi-stakeholder model was the supreme model, but on policy issues in terms of what sovereign states have to legislate for, the multilateral model is the supreme one for many governments. So I think that many countries are playing atypical roles on this debate, and I think it would be a mistake to polarize them into camps, because what we're trying to do, both in the government sector, in the multilateral sphere, but also hopefully within the wider community of developers and academics who are contributing to this enormous potential, is find the platforms where all of these views can contribute to solutions. And I think that was outlined also in the first panel, that we can't address this in a big structural approach anymore. There is no one big structure that can address all of these issues. Rather, I think there are many platforms around the world around specific problems that can coalesce and be brought together to address the challenges. And I think that the UN could be one of many houses where an evolving set of principles or an evolving compact around how we would like to see the positive elements of this discourse evolve could emerge and have universal legitimacy.
Could I add to what the ambassador said, just to make clear that where we agree about the UN? It might have sounded like I was too negative. When we think about the role of the UN, it's several different things. I mean, one is the ITU, where there is a particular regulatory role for the ITU, which is not, in quotes, governing the internet, but is a important implementation of agreements that states have made over a long time. Another aspect, though, of the UN is the first and third committees of the General Assembly. And that can lead to resolutions about, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is tabled, which are sort of rather grandiose, not particularly, in my view, not particularly fruitful as ways to evolve. But a third aspect is the role that the UN has played in the group of government experts. And that's quite fascinating, because the UN sets up lots of GGEs. I mean, but they rarely rise out of the basement of the UN. I mean, they're usually, below the radar. But the UN GGE on information and cyber is really quite extraordinary. They start meeting in 2004, can't get an agreement on much, but from the 2013 and then 15 reports, you have something which is quite extraordinary, a set of norms which is agreed to by the major states. And that 2015 report was then endorsed by the group of 20, which is the 20 most capable economies in the world. This is a group of government experts appointed by the Secretary General, obviously with consultation from governments, which rises up to the point where it is indeed setting the agenda. And that, to me, is much more fruitful than a big UN resolution passed by the General Assembly about the type that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has tabled now for several years. The problem, though, which is a problem for all UN aspects, is something that the former diplomat Harlan Cleveland used to say: how do you get everybody into the act and still get action? The GGE went from 15 to 20, 20 to 25, And now in conversations I've had with the current chair of the GG, there's a strong pressure that in the future it should expand much more. When it expands much more, it may no longer be able to accomplish what it's accomplished so far. So this problem of how do you get everybody into the act and still get action is going to be a major problem in terms of developing norms. In certain areas of internet governance, if you're talking about the IANA function, or if you're talking about domain name issues that are within ICANN, you can say, well, the experts still play a major role. This is where multi-stakeholderism is very powerful. Without the ISOC and the IETF, you wouldn't be able to make any progress there. I mean, it's not something that governments alone do, and they're in this case, not the companies, but the technocrats, or if you want the experts, play a critical role. So some aspects of internet governance and multi-stakeholderism works perfectly, and the small numbers make it workable. But as we develop these broad norms for internet and cyber as a whole, what's remarkable is that the UN GGE process has done as well as it's done, but I think it's probably running out of steam because of this demand for further participation. But it'd be interesting, you're on the scene, it'd be interesting to see what you think of that.
I think do you want me to address that or another question?
Please go ahead.
I think I subscribe to the view that that process has, because of its small size, moved quite remarkably quickly. And as you said, that's the issue, the perpetual challenge at the UN is that its strength lies in its universality. So when all the countries are around the table and in the room, and not just the countries, with the WISES process, it's very much about involving civil society and the technology companies and other stakeholders. And actually that was a continual struggle in facilitating the process, is that there is a spectrum in which there are some countries who would like them in the room all the time, observing every aspect of the negotiation, and there are other countries who very much believe that the intergovernmental aspect of negotiation around these norms is a private affair of governments that shouldn't be necessarily observed by civil society, who should be brought into the room to give their input, and then the negotiations continue. So that perpetual struggle between different worldviews of the nature of civil society and its contribution to the evolution of norms is something that has to be managed continually at the UN. But I think this process was a very important one. One of the fundamental principles that it did endorse was, of course, that countries would broadly agree that civilian infrastructure shouldn't be the target of cyber attacks. Now, and I think it's important to have these norms evolve over time, because eventually they start becoming national legislation in countries as countries subscribe to them or not. Of course, in terms of the nature of the threats, and as we've seen the sort of weaponization of everything as it has been described, will countries necessarily subscribe to that as we move forward remains to be seen. But I think if they are not hampered by normative processes that they very much believe in, you are going to see a much faster evolution of the weaponization of everything than you would otherwise. And that's where I think the fundamental strength of the basement negotiations are incredibly important, because sometimes the countries that have the most to lose within those rooms are also the countries that you really need to bring on board in the kind of broader global struggle, if you like, over values and norms.
I want to reserve some time for questions from the floor, but first I'm going to abuse the prerogatives of the moderator to ask a follow-up question on the specific role of the UN. Let's stipulate, for the sake of argument, that it's entirely appropriate and non-controversial for the UN to debate norms and principles on all of these issues relating to the cyber realm. But with discussion about different, more activist roles for the UN bubbling up from the basement, bubbling up from Study Group 3 of the ITU, which recently had a meeting in Geneva, where they debated proposals that envisioned a UN that would have the power to impose data tariffs, that would have the authority to shape the future of artificial intelligence, that would have authority for mobile financial transactions, that would have a role for consumer safety and security. These are aspects of the ITU's mandate that many believe far exceed its constitutional authority. Could you both very briefly comment on whether you think this type of granular role for the UN is appropriate?
You want it first?
The short answer is it may or may not be appropriate depending on the country you come from, but it certainly won't be effective. And it certainly won't be relevant if that's the approach. As I said in the outset, I think different countries take a different view to how prescriptive the UN can be and what its mandate should be, what the mandate of sovereign governments should be. But I think with this topic, potentially has, if it hasn't already, has the potential to far outstrip the ability of governments to regulate. And I think it already has done that. So with that reality check in mind, with that reality check of the world we actually live in, I think for governments, and governments legitimately and genuinely want to address some of the challenges that have been thrown up into the air because of that approach, that this is so exciting, the revolution in AI, that we just go forward without thinking about the implications for the private citizen. But as a private citizen, and I'm not talking now in terms of representing any government, as a private citizen, I personally would like to have a say in how big data is collected and who owns that data. I would like to have a say about whether, when I go for a job interview, my prospective employer has an amalgamation of information about me, whether it's from my Fitbit or my phone or my medical records at the hospital that is now automated by AI, that tells my prospective employer, wow, Lana's not necessarily a good investment in your company for the next 25 years. She's got this and that issue, her cholesterol's high, she's eaten this amount of food in the last 2 weeks, some of it has been a little bit heavy on the donut side, some of it's been a little... That is all within the realm of possibility today. When you talk about big data, that is very much within the realm of possibility. And what I think from a government perspective we are seeing is that the private citizen has not been able to give an opinion about who owns that data, about how that data is disseminated and used. And I know you all are very cognizant of the fact that today, because of how that data is being sold to advertising and in the marketplace, that things pop up on your screen uninvited today because of your purchasing habits, because of your internet surfacing habits, and so on, without you having had a view about how that information was distributed. So I think those are the issues that we legitimately, as governments, would like to see both government and the private citizen have a say on before we let the impressiveness and the wonderful innovation of this technology far outpace the abilities of governments to varying degrees to allow their netizens to have a view on that. And I think that's the fundamental issue. But to go back to your question, the basement negotiations will not be the fix for that. They are important in creating a certain set of shared principles that we all subscribe to on issues like the privacy of citizens. And from that spectrum, it's not entirely the spectrum simply of the freedom of expression and freedom of speech. There are other really fundamental issues about how citizens interact with the internet, with the cyberspace, that I think are fundamental for governments to get a grip on.
All right, let's try to get a couple of questions in from the floor, please. Yes, back there.
Kenneth Protsipa, a simple question. What can we learn from the IPCC model that would be transferable to this sector?
Well, one of the IPCC model is the...
Would you explain what it is for those?
Yeah, I was just about, it is the body of scientists, climate scientists, who have basically established a peer review process for laying a baseline of what science is on climate change. And it is relevant to us in the following sense, that the climate area is also described by people who study international institutions and norms as a regime complex. There's no single hierarchical structure, but there are several, and it's fragmented, but not totally fragmented. the IPCC plays the role of laying a baseline. So if you look at the role they've played, they've said here are certain things which give us a framework for which governments then can negotiate. There's no exact model for this. One possible interesting idea is Microsoft has recently come up with the idea in the last year of creating a international attribution panel modeled on, it would be non-governmental experts who would come to a judgment which they would make public about who was responsible for certain attacks or not responsible for certain attacks. So it goes beyond just the work that certs would be. It would be, they sometimes talk about it as being a little bit like the International Atomic Energy Agency. That's slightly misleading because the IAEA is a considerable bureaucracy with a considerable budget. And I think what Microsoft has suggested is won't be as large as something like the IPCC, but it would be an effort to say, can we find a way where a body of technical experts and scientists would come to a judgment and state their judgments to the public, like the IPCC does. So it's not an exact analogy, but it's along the same lines, and it fits with the multi-stakeholder idea, which is don't rely just on governments, rely also on other aspects of tripartitism, if you want. We think of civil society and the various aspects of civil society that can be mobilized in support. I think there is room for thinking more about this in the cyber area.
Another question? Sir.
Professor Nye, Ambassador, thank you. I'm Blake Rhodes from West Point, and I just had a question about what you thought the role of privacy-enhancing technologies, mainly encryption-based technologies, and reducing fragmentation worldwide. Do you think it's going to be? Do you think it's important, and do you think it's going to become more important as we go into the future? Thank you.
Well, why don't we each take a crack at that? I think encryption has already seen a huge jump. If you look at the shock of the Snowden revelations in 2013, it broke apart the relations between the American companies and the American government. And the companies responded by essentially encrypting more and more of their products. And so whether you like it or not, I happen to like it. Encryption has already increased enormously since Snowden. And I suspect that's the trend of the future. I think that is useful. I was on a panel that we had at Harvard, at the Berkman Center, that produced a report that some of you may have seen called Don't Panic. And the argument was a reply to the director of the FBI and others who said, if you have this encryption and the government doesn't have a way to break it, we're going to be the victim of terrorists. I mean, we have to be able to break this. And the conclusion of this group that looked at it, which included technologists as well as lawyers as well as oddbods like me, the conclusion was that we weren't going dark. What was happening is that if you use that same metaphor that Comey introduced, that there were areas of the landscape which were going to be heavily shaded, like being behind a tree or a rock because of encryption. But the Internet of Things was introducing bright light all over the place, which had never been there before. So rather than the question of are we at risk of going dark and thereby being victims of terrorists? We said no. In fact, if we should be focusing on something else, which are what are the implications for privacy of the Internet of Things, and how do we set up a framework to understand what that means? So, so we're now working on a set of principles that should guide the Internet of Things. But the argument that, encryption is here to stay. It's going to increase. Law enforcement has to get beyond, and intelligence has to get beyond the view that this is the enemy. In fact, they've got to learn to work in a world where there will be a lot of encryption. And what I've suggested by this metaphor is that there are lots of other ways besides just breaking the code on an Apple iPhone.
I think it's an incredibly interesting and complex question, and I think Professor Nye's outlined the complexity between the lightness and the dark. First of all, from the perspective of security forces and some very, very brave people around the world who really have to grapple with this fundamental problem that they want access to potential terrorists and their online profile. And of course, the right to privacy enshrined in the Declaration of Human Rights and in many governments' national legislations. And paradoxically, the more of an internet profile a would-be terrorists have, the more likelihood today in the kind of big data sense we are to be able to stop the perpetuation of terrorist activity. I think the complexity of the debate is actually illustrated by the fact that I wouldn't have said, I would have been surprised if I had heard the European debate evolve the way it had a couple of years ago. But if you had told me that a year ago I would hear ministers in Europe ask companies that the encryption of their applications is now something that has to be discussed and thought about very seriously because of the threat posed by terrorism, I wouldn't have imagined the debate in Europe would have evolved that way. And I think this has to bring us back to the fundamental realities of some of the big meta trends that we're seeing that are defining and shaping the public discourse, of course, for many of these populist movements that are asking for more intervention from government, that are calling for closing of borders, that are creating more nationalist or populist movements in those countries, that are anti-migration, that are anti so the diversity of communities that we see that has evolved over time in many of these countries. So I think we are looking at the juxtaposition of a number of competing trends that are quite difficult for governments to grapple with. And fundamentally, on the issue of encryption, I think it's going to be an evolving conversation. On the one hand, it could potentially lead to which is, I think, something that many of us who are proponents of the positive aspects of the cyber world would not like to see, but it could potentially lead to what has been described here as fragmentation, or what has been described elsewhere as balkanization of the internet, where countries clamp down and say, no, we're going to try and control these within our borders by creating our own platforms, our own spaces, and we're not going to allow the penetration that is bringing so much positive development in terms of input into economy. I mean, the Middle East today is, in terms of GDP, and the digital economy is only 50% contributing to the economy of the Middle East, as opposed to where it's contributing in the US. And I think that divide, a lot of countries are trying to jumpstart and get the positive elements of that contribution to the economy that the digital world brings, but at the same time harness very, very difficult and complex questions. So I think if you look at it in terms of the bigger trends, you don't want to see what has actually happened because of the Snowden case that you've outlined. And I think that Carl Bildt's group has done some data around that and show a very interesting graph about the decline of internet users as a result of that people's online behavior has significantly changed as a result of that. And so you're seeing a kind of drawing away from many of the positive aspects of development that the technology brings because of fears around privacy, because of fears around security, because of fears around how that data is used. So beyond the question of terrorism and the kind of militarization of this subject, I think, as Professor Nye has said, there is a much broader debate that we have to tap into, that we have to engage in a multi-stakeholder manner around the Internet of Things, around where that data is processed and used, and ultimately how to harness it for positive development, because I think that would be the biggest shame of how the debate goes, is if we don't collectively agree that there are many potential benefits that outweigh the risk, then we are going to see that balkanization happen in a much more rigid way across governments.
As you would expect when you bring an outstanding thought leader and an outstanding diplomat to the subject that we're discussing today, we end with more questions than answers. But unfortunately, we must end. I'm told I have to move this along. Please join me in thanking our two experts.
Well, I very much agree with what you said.
Yeah, I think we were in agreement.
Yeah.